Fun. You're live.
Ooh.
Oh, we're live. And in Technicolor.
Okay, so this is when we start. Who's hosting? We never discussed this part. All right.
We're all the hosts now.
Yeah, we can share the link now and then we'll get going, I guess.
Oh my gosh, it's just a rainy Wednesday, Thursday. I don't even know anymore. Oh gosh. Time to go home, wrap myself up in a nice big weighted blanket. And have my cat screech at me in the background. So if you hear her, she's just saying hi. Okay. Well, hello to everyone who's joined us. Welcome to this month's Hot Dish. My name is Tanith. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the Vice President of No Divide KC, and I'm joined with two amazing, wonderful board members who, if you would like to introduce yourself, go now.
I'm Kat, and my pronouns are she, they. And I'm part of the artistic community and one of the main board members.
And I'm JD. My pronouns are they or he. I'm also a part of the artistic committee and the board.
Babies all around. I'm just surrounded by just non-binary goodies. Yes. Oh, awesome. Well, this month we're continuing our positivity series. We're going to be discussing a faction of sexy times, or not even sexy times, because it can happen outside of that. Looking at kink, what that means, what that entails, how we participate in that, and kind of go into that. If you are on YouTube, don't forget you can enter in your questions, chats into the top chat section where you can answer questions. I can't watch myself, though, at the same time. So put your questions there. Maybe we'll answer them as we go through. That would be awesome to have some participation from you guys there at home. But let's dive into this complex, amazing, beautiful topic.
How do you want to start? Do you want to start by how do we define what kink is? How do y'all define it?
I think an easier question was, how did you first discover what kink was?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah.
I'll start. I was a really bad kid. Me and my cousin, we used to play really advanced grown-up play. We used to play this imaginary idea that we were single moms escaping from our abusive husbands, raising our children. And so because we were living this stressful life at night, we were trying to watch Skinamax on HBO, and Skinamax on HBO has such a variety of different sexy things going on, and little by little things would happen there, and I'm like, this is interesting. And obviously, even though I still had that shared one computer in the household when I was younger, it doesn't mean that you can't find a way to look up things when your parents aren't there. As well as I don't know if you guys remember this, but do you guys remember what was it? Those weird links like Lemon Party and
yes.
Yes.
What's the other one where it would go, you spin, meat spin? Those two.
Meat spin, yes.
Oh, old school internet right there. Oh my gosh.
Very graphic.
Yeah.
That's how you know that the internet started way too early and we had access at too young of an age when things like that were running around.
Oh God. Yeah, it's like you stumble into it accidentally. I think my first introduction to kink was just in my early days. This will date me, but of Zanga and LiveJournal. and like reading fan fiction.
Yeah.
You're 12, 13 years old, and you're just like reading this stuff, and all of a sudden there's this like strange new thing coming up, and you're like, what's that? And then you hop down the rabbit hole to figure out what it is, and you're like, oh, okay, all right. And next thing you know, 20 years later, here you are.
Like so unfazed by it at this point.
Right. What about you, JD?
I can't pinpoint like the first kinky thing that I encountered. I first encountered porn when I was like 11, but I don't think any of the porn that I was watching was very kinky. I definitely like when I was just able to get on the internet on my own, like between the ages of like 14 and 16, like getting on the internet or reading dirty comics and seeing, like you're saying, you said, Taylor, like you find something that's like a new thing, you don't quite understand it, and then you go down the internet rabbit hole of like, so that at that point, like by 16, I was like starting to learn, I can't remember, 14, 15 or 16, started learning about BDSM and things like that, which might be a nice segue to talk about what BDSM is. Does anybody want to define that for our audience? I could do it if we want to.
Go for it.
So BDSM is like a mega acronym. It's BD, like bondage and discipline, and then DS, dominance and submission, and then SM, sadism and masochism. That's a whole lot of different things. Kink doesn't necessarily have to fall into that umbrella, I think, but that does cover a lot of things that we would normally think of as kinky. I don't know where to go from that.
Yeah, it's a great umbrella term too, because like one of my favorite things about like the BDSM community is like they're like, my kink's not your kink. And that's okay. And so there's like, it's based on this foundation of consent and respect and finding a partner or partners who, are into the same weird stuff or not so weird stuff as you are. And just kind of going from there with this like mutual love of what you're doing together. Or if you're more voyeuristic, watching together. So there's like room for everybody in that an acronym, which you're right, it is an acronym. I didn't even think about that until you said that. I was like, oh yeah, there's so much you can just punch into that.
There's a lot in there. I mean, bondage would be, of course, like if you enjoy tying someone up or being tied up. Discipline, is like a type of relationship in which there is some type of discipline involved or rules involved. And then dominance and submission, I feel like a lot of people tend to understand that in general. And then sadism and masochism is playing with pain. Sadism giving the pain, masochism receiving the pain. And so all these things can kind of overlap in different ways, but you could also take stuff or leave stuff. It's like a buffet, I think.
Oh, an all you can eat buffet. Yes, absolutely. Oh gosh, yeah. I started getting like personally involved with kink maybe 10 years ago. Because I'm a late bloomer. I mentioned that in our sex positivity episode. I'm a late bloomer. I didn't start having sex until I was 24, so about 10 years ago. And so as I started, experimenting and figuring out what I like and what I enjoy, I started diving into kink and BDSM to see what that was about. My my upbringing was pretty vanilla, which means status quo, pretty normal, nothing exciting, pretty plain vanilla, like vanilla cake or plain yogurt, if you will. So not like super duper exciting, but discovering kink and getting involved in that like made things so much more exciting and enjoyable, and provided a lot of healing in a lot of ways. It presented control where I had none before. It gave me the ability to connect on such a intimate level. The level of consent that was there was something that I wasn't getting in a lot of different ways. And I guess that brings up a point that I wanted to talk about, is that BDSM and kink isn't necessarily just something you have to practice with sex.
No. I think people, especially when you're younger, you it's kind of weird. And I don't know if you guys noticed this, but like, you know, the kink and BDSM community tend to be coincide with the LGBT community very often, because these are very taboo, or what you would think back then was taboo subjects to talk about. So they would usually always go side by side. And when I was involving myself more with my sexuality, kink would also just seem to be like on the sidelines. And it was like any way you would turn, it would always show up, which I thought was kind of interesting. So like in the beginning of like discovering my sexuality, I thought, you know, kink was a necessary thing to be involved. But then I realized it's not. It's just, it seems to be that they just always been on the same lane in the course of like subject matter and lifestyle, but they're not necessarily together or need to be together in any way.
Yeah, I've known people who, not necessarily personally, but often just through the internet, like people who have kinks that are lifestyle kinks, like you use the word lifestyle, you know, and I think it might be hard for a lot of, maybe some of our audience members to understand, especially if they're vanilla, because that's just the way that it's portrayed in the mainstream, that kink is a sexual thing. But kink could just describe the way you have a relationship with somebody that isn't vanilla. So it may be a power exchange relationship in which one person is dominant and wields a dominant power, and one person is submissive and wields a submissive power. But that doesn't necessarily mean that sex is involved in that. There could be different things that are colored by that type of power exchange. It could mean the way that household chores are done, or it could mean the way, like, who chooses what you eat, or what you wear. Sometimes, you know, it depends on like what you've negotiated.
Something that I've been reading up on since quarantine, since the panorama started, I've been reading about like financial domination, in which you have a dom who controls your finances, tells you how you spend your money, who you give it to, what your allowance is, if you get one. Sometimes like there's like a mutual like blackmail involved, like, ooh, I caught you doing something really bad, give me all your money, or I'm going to tell all your friends you're into this weird shit, sort of thing. And so like that is an exchange of power. Like there might be sex involved, but it's not the foundation of that that kinky relationship.
Talking about financial domination leads me into like a great story, because when I dom, I tend to be really nervous about doming. I'm more of a submissive person. I think just because I tend to be so neurotic and control heavy in my vanilla life, I like to really be able to just let go in with submission and just let go of control. But I do have a dominant side, and one thing I found at one point was that I like cyber doming, because then there's a certain barrier up, which I know that for some doms that's like a bad barrier. They want to be able to do stuff in person, and I totally respect that. But for me, that gave me kind of an interface with which to understand my own dominance, and it gives me, you know, time and space. I'm in my own room, you know, and I'm in that safe place to think, okay, how do I want to give this submissive person an experience that they want to have? And so at one point I was cyber doming this submissive person. And of course I won't reveal any of their identity because they trusted me with their personal information. Basically, it was sort of fin doming, except I wasn't controlling how they spend their money. It was more like I just had access to their computer that they gave me, and just had access to all their personal information. So at one point, like, their social security number was my phone background.
Wow.
Hot damn.
It's like, it was like bizarre to me at first, but I sort of liked it. I was just like, it didn't last very long because I just wasn't something that I was into enough that I could sustain it long term. But while I was doing it, like, it was just interesting to like play with that power. And like I said, to have this like digital interface through which to do it, because that was the ideal way to do this domination, because what he would do is screen share his computer and then give me control over it. So we could just do that from far away. And so then I could go through, and he would, and for him, it was a sexual thing. He would get off to, like, while I'm going through everything and like going through his emails, going through his messages, verbally humiliating him about it. was just an interesting experience. It's just a great memory. I hope he's doing okay.
You're a hacker daddy. Oh
Well, it's
my
not like
gosh.
it's not like
That's
I
a
did
new-
anything hacking. It's just he gave me access.
Like instead of being the hacker man meme, you're hacker daddy. Oh my
Hacker Dom Daddy.
ah, I'm living this life. I love it. Oh my gosh, that's so great. That's
Glad you brought that up. I
amazing.
just wanted to tell that story because it was just interesting. Like, you know, like that's just something that really, really was good for him. And I was really nervous at first because I was like, do you really want me? Like, do you really trust me to look at all of your personal information? And so then I took that trust very seriously. Like, I've never shown his information anywhere. I'll never reveal his name or face or anything. Even though I have pictures of him, like holding his ID card and things like that. Like, nobody will ever know. But it's just a story I can tell, like, without revealing any sensitive details. It's interesting.
I love that. That's amazing. Oh,
Yeah.
stop eating this. Stop it. My cat. Sorry.
It's fine. But I understand that sort of barrier aspect because there was like a time in my life when I was like in college, I was doing phone sex. And sometimes in phone sex, you have to play different characters. And more often than not, they like a more dominant individual. That's where I experienced very vast different types of kinks where people would really go into some extreme details of what their fantasies were, especially on the phone, which is great because not only do you not have to see me, all you have to do is like the bare minimum is like I can imagine what you look like and you don't have to see me and don't know any of my personal information because we didn't have each other's phone number. It was on through a line. And so sometimes some people would go on to some wild tangents. I was like signed up to different websites for their hotlines, and one was like for I'm sure you've heard of these, but it's I forgot what the name of it specifically is, but it's it deals with diapers. And
Oh, yeah.
Oh, ABDL.
what?
I don't
That-
think it's
that
that
was it?
one. I
Okay.
think it's like adult baby.
Yeah.
D
ABDL.
yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So they would get into like aspects of wanting for me to role play like I'm their mom and they are a teenager and they need me to like change their diaper in the middle of a public mall because they're embarrassed. And it was like, okay. Like at like some points I'd be like really awkward about it, but it was interesting to hear them get real into this role play sometimes. And obviously there's other times where like some people just went way too far. I'm like, I'm good. And even though like sometimes my bosses would be like, no, you need to continue. They're trying to get a rise out of you. It's like, no, I need to know where my limits are. And I understand money is involved, but if my mental health is not doing well or this is like too far, which is also another important thing about kink is knowing your limits. If you go too far, sometimes it can damage not only yourself but the other person. So that's why there's like in kinks the most important thing is like your hard limits, your soft limits, what you're into, what are your goals in regards to like a session. So like a session would mean, especially like in a more professional sense or in a proper sense, a session is like that moment in time where you and another person set up a specific time saying we're going to do this today and we're going to do this for a certain amount of time. What are you comfortable with and all that? Because not every single day or every single time you meet up are you down for the same thing or your body can contribute to similar things, you know?
Yeah. It's like when I brought up at the beginning, like how consent is so important in exploring any facet of kink, you know? Like, for example, I'm very into impact play, which is part of the S&M part of BDSM. And for those who don't know, I like being hit, but I don't want to be punched. I don't want to be abused. I don't need a black eye. I don't, I'm not interested in that. But I do like, having a handprint imprinted onto my flesh because you smacked me in the right way, but I also have chronic pain issues, so my pain tolerance is very, very high. Someone else might not be able to tolerate the type of pain that I can, and so you have to discuss those limits and have that level of trust and respect and consent before like even going into that, whether you're a dominant or a submissive. It's not just do whatever you want to me. That could be damaging, that could be harmful.
Yeah. Something I definitely want audiences to know, especially if you're vanilla, if you're interested in exploring kink, avoid anybody that says they have no limits or they want somebody who has no limits, because that's not a real thing. Somebody who says that they have no limits has been probably taught that by saying they have no limits, they get rewarded with attention, and it may be negative attention, but it may be what that filling a need for them. But they do have limits. They just don't know it yet, and they don't know how to assert those. Somebody who's saying that they want somebody who has no limits is wanting to abuse somebody. So it's really important to know, like you were saying, hard limits and soft limits. So soft limits would be something that maybe you want to explore and you want to tease at, you want to push maybe a little bit, or something that you may be willing to try in a certain situation, but not in all situations. A hard limit would be something that you absolutely have to say no. And the willingness to say no and creating an environment in which it's safe to say no is really, really important. I think in everything that you do with somebody, whether it's sexual or not, but I think that kinky people take that very, very seriously. We're talking about these things that might seem kind of extreme, like being hit. I also like to be hit, but it's not just, generally, I think kinky people take a really high standard on negotiation and consent. Of course, it has kinky community has problems like any other community, but it takes a lot of trust, takes a lot of communication. So for me, with impact play, I do like to be hit, but I don't have a very high pain tolerance. So there's only like very certain types of pain that I like, and I can only go so far with it. I need somebody who's gentle and starts slow. It needs to be certain types of pain. So sometimes in the impact play community, we talk about thuddy pain versus a stingy pain. So it's like, a loose paddle that gives like a thuddy type of pain versus something that stings like a whip. I'm a thuddy pain person. Stingy pain is too much for me usually. And then another thing that I wanted to talk about, because it relates to this in my experience, is headspace. So I'm not just going to be ready, and most people are not going to be ready to just start hitting someone or being hit. You kind of have to work yourself into a different psychological headspace. So it can be very trance-like, it can be very hypnotic. It's when you are giving yourself into a transformed experience, an experience that's different than a vanilla experience. And once you're in that state, then you may be willing to do things that you wouldn't do in your vanilla life. So I have to be in kind of that headspace, and then somebody needs to help me get into that headspace before I'm ready to be hit. Like, if you just start hitting me, it's not going to work.
No, don't touch me. Yeah, absolutely.
With all things sexual, there's foreplay involved in every aspect. People forget about that. Foreplay is the most important thing, man.
And foreplay isn't just like slow touching as soon as you see each other. It's texting, it's calling, it's saying, hey, I know we're getting together next week, but I can't wait to see you. I can't wait for you to smack my face. I can't wait for you to do this to me, sort of thing. And it's building up that expectation, the tension that will be ultimately released when you get together for your session. And it's interesting and wonderful, because like being a part of kink has really helped me learn how to negotiate. We've mentioned this before, that it's all about communication and negotiation. And honestly, I use all of those skills like if I want to buy a new car or if I want to, make a deal with somebody on Facebook Market to get a piece of furniture that I'm really interested in. And so it's skills you can apply to other things, not just, your preferred kink, which there are hundreds of thousands, if not more, choices for you to get into. What is it? Rule 34, if it exists, there's porn of it, sort of thing, like there's something out there for everyone. And there's always a niche community too within like the umbrella kinks that are out there.
speaking of new discovering kinks, have you seen this like meme on the internet where people are like, I think some people are discovering they have a fetish about things getting stuck up their nose because of the COVID testing, and some people are getting pleasure out of those things getting so far up that they're like, oh man, this feels kind of good. I don't know how to explain that. It's like, there you go. You discovered your new kink spot. Good job.
You found an erogenous zone. Congratulations.
I feel like you should have an award with that next to the testing. Yeah, you found something different.
Oh my gosh, like if you guys are gamers, like an achievement sound just goes off in the background. No. Bleep bloop. Congratulations.
You found it.
New kink found.
Oh God, imagine poor doctors if they would have to hear that, be like, oh no.
That's like a good like fan fiction writing prompt out there for all you writers. Oh my gosh. Yeah, kink is just such a wonderful, complex, interesting, safe haven for you to like explore your fantasies. You know, like we talked about role playing before. I love role playing. I think it's like really fun to explore like power exchanges or just like act out your favorite Lord of the Rings couple, you know, hooking up in the middle of the night. Like there's so many different ways to go about it. And I think that's what makes it really fun and tantalizing. Like it's always a different experience, even if you are with a consistent partner or if you're with a new partner every time.
Yeah. Do you guys have any like kind of embarrassing or bad kink stories you'd be willing to share?
Ooh.
Gotta
throw those in there, huh?
I don't know if it was like necessarily like a sexual experience, but okay. So a lot of my art deals a lot with like sexuality. So when I was first starting college, that was when I was getting really involved with it, and a lot of my art was shown that, and I would actively talk about sex with all my like, you know, classmates. I mean, this is like one of my artworks. I'm clearly not embarrassed to talk about sex. So there was an incident where I was doing art, and some kid from the hallway, I guess, had been like watching me make art and knowing the topics that I was making of. And he just felt that he was so comfortable with me. He started talking with me, and he straight up told me, oh yeah, I'm really involved with like the diaper loving community. I love the idea of like trying to, I'm like, thank you for telling me that, but that's really left field. I'm not the audience, but I'm glad that you feel that you're comfortable. That's not me, because he thought that I was interested, and I'm like, no.
Oh God, that reminds me. I was trying to rack my brain, but that totally reminds me. I did burlesque for 7 years, both here in Kansas City and in Portland, Oregon. And one time after a show here in KC, we went to the now gone Chubby's down on Broadway for an after show, like biscuits and gravy, because why not? But it was some B&G after a show, and we all went, and there were some people from our audience, some regulars who would come to our monthly show and hang out, and we were sitting at the table, and there were two people, a man and a woman, and they wouldn't shut up about their kinks. Like, just wouldn't stop. And I was like, I just look, just because I get naked in front of people doesn't mean I want to talk about what you do behind closed doors. Like, cool. And then their kink were dressing his penis up in little outfits and taking photo shoots. And like they would give the head googly eyes, and like he'd go on vacation and have like Hawaiian shirts on and like a Santa outfit and like put background, so like fully erect penis dressing up in costume. And they're like, look at these pictures, and we're in a public place and they're showing pictures, and I was like, I know you've been drinking, you need to stop.
Not in this chubby.
This is not consent. You need to stop. Like, oh.
Just because your kink is talking about these sexual things out in the open, I'm not the party.
I mean, they did take some cool photos. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I was really impressed that they made like
I
a
would be
penis look that
nosy.
cute. But I was just like, I'm trapped in a chubby's.
I think that brings up an interesting point, because on the one hand, we want to like encourage positivity and openness about kink and be able to talk about it, but also it's kink is one of those things where you have to like really be careful about how you introduce it into vanilla space. I think that kink is one of those things where like it actually is a good thing that there are kink spaces and vanilla spaces. I don't know how you both feel about that. Maybe you can disagree and push back. I'm totally open to that, but
There's a time and a place.
yeah, you know, like it's I think when you can insert kink into a vanilla space, I think that's cool. But like you just gotta be really careful. Like one example that I've seen used is like going back to impact play. Like you don't just do impact play in public in a non-kink space, because then people think that there's actual abuse happening. And it's a good thing that they have that instinct, because in vanilla space, if somebody's punching somebody else, then the community should rally around that and intervene, instead of just thinking, oh, well, maybe it's a kinky thing, on the off chance that maybe they're just a kink couple doing it in public. Like, you know, you should have that vanilla mechanism in vanilla space to intervene in abuse. And then you should have the kink space where it's okay, and you know that there's negotiation, there's consent, and if somebody's safe words, then you intervene.
Oh,
So,
and it's that consent too, because like everybody's allowed to have their kink, but if you're out in public, you can't get the consent of all of those people that are out there. There might be some minors, you know, underage people seeing what you're doing, and you're not going to get their consent. Like, come on, let's think about this for 2 seconds. You know, I remember reading a tweet thread. I can't remember who posted it, but like some girl was like, oh yeah, I was drinking piss in public and tried to get my girlfriend to do it too at
it's
a
better
pride
to
parade. And I was just like, no, that's not what you're supposed to do.
do that in a kinky street fair, but maybe not otherwise. That's like the only type of public place you could want to do that, really.
So and like they were defending their right to do whatever they want. It was their person, blah blah blah. And I was just like, but consent of those around you.
Yeah,
Totally
that happens a
agree.
lot.
Yeah.
Like even sometimes in pride parades, and not to like downgrade these people, but like people who show up in like very elaborate fetish gear that might be a little too much for a public place. Like even though like pride back then was a very like closed group and it was considered more of like an adult space, now we reached, you know, as a more like open society, and realized that, you know, being queer does not equate to being just an adult, but you know, now teenagers are being involved. Does that mean like now in these pride parades or like pride events, should we be more considerate of these kinks or like sort of fetish stuff to not be so like hand in hand with these locations? Because like I think I had that conversation with a friend where very more often than not, like more like so much like queer spaces tend to be geared to very adult themes, and where can a kid or a teen try to figure out their sexuality without being exposed so much to, you know, this extreme sexual side where maybe they're not ready for that conversation yet, or they don't need that start.
Yeah, this creates a really interesting and kind of difficult conversation, because looking at history, you know, the queer community and the kinky community had, you know, like you were saying, like there was a lot in common. They often went together, and a lot of the activism went together and still does. And I think that's a good thing. And then when we talk about our queer events needing to be family friendly, sometimes that gets us into the realm of respectability politics, where now we're censoring ourselves and we're trying to be like, oh, well, we're not like the other queers. We're the clean queers that are good for like good homey white Anglo-Saxon Protestant family values, right? But then there's the other thing, like you said, queer youth deserve spaces that they don't really have right now, because so many spaces for queer people are adult spaces. There are bars, there are these parades where there's fetish gear and things like that. And there's things that they're maybe not ready for. So it's difficult to manage those spaces. I feel like it's just all the more reason why we should support kinky street fairs that are designed for adults, that are separate from the mainstream pride parades, where more extreme stuff can happen, where it is adults only, because often those often get stigmatized, even though often those are like very clearly planned, and it's like very clear if you're entering that space, and you can very easily avoid it. And that's where people can actually completely be themselves. And that's one of the few places, like, you know, there's just not a lot of kinky community for a lot of people. So I think it's important to have that. Also, thinking about like consent of others, that can also become like a two-sided thing, because then you wonder, like, so for example, I'm wearing this cuff. This to me has kinky meaning, but am I exposing other people or violating other people's consent just by wearing it? Probably not, because most people may not even know what it means. It just looks like an accessory. But then people who are in the know, they know. And that's kind of the cool thing about that. But then, of course, that's different than drinking piss in public and trying to make your partner do that, right? So there's all these, it's
It's a
hard
balancing act
yeah, it's so
between
hard to
all of
do.
it, and a lot of really great questions that I think are being asked and being discussed throughout the community, and whether online or in person, you know, and it's constantly evolving, right? Like, this isn't a stagnant thing. Kink is not stagnant. It's anything but. So it's constantly evolving. And I love that about that, because it's growing, it's changing, it's being not, you know, as a white person saying it, being super white, vanilla, heteronormative, cis heteronormative space. Because it's a great place for people who don't identify with that, who don't fit in with that bubble, to, you know, be themselves. You know, that I think that's why queerness and kink often go hand in hand, is because it presents a space where you're not trapped by the box of a white supremacist society.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And there is a question in the chat, which is
Ooh.
going to kind of like divert us a little bit. But Stacy is asking, do you have stories of when you thought you had a fantasy and then realized you didn't actually have that fantasy? Like, did we ever get into a situation where you're like, yes, this fantasy, I'm so into doing it, and then, oh no, never mind.
I have been in this situation. It's involves some kind of extreme kinks that I don't know if I want to talk about on YouTube. But I'll just say that, like, I was asked to do kind of a somewhat extreme act as a top, meaning like I'm performing the act on somebody else who was completely enthusiastic and consenting. It was their idea. They wanted to submit to it. And then I did it, and then it just did not feel right. It's a really distinct feeling. I don't know how to describe it. It's almost a dysphoric type of feeling when you're doing something that's just like not the right kink for you, especially if it's something more extreme and you realize this is too extreme for me, this is not for me. Thankfully, no one was harmed, and my submissive was fine. And this person was also somebody who's usually dominant with me, so we were kind of switching roles. It was interesting. So it was good to try. Like, I don't regret having tried it, because then I learned from that. I learned that I don't like that. That I don't want to do it. So I just took it as a learning experience.
My situation was with a sugar daddy and their girlfriend. They wanted me to be involved in like a two-way dominant session, and right before anything got too serious, it was just a pit in my stomach that just was like, I think this is not it. I think we rushed into the idea. It was great. Maybe it felt better via text. Maybe instead of, I felt like realizing after the fact when we spoke about it, we were like, maybe it sounded better in text and in writing than in the act of it. Because when we all were in that physical space, it just felt off and was not the vibe. It was not passing the vibe checks. We just felt really weird and awkward. It was like, we're pushing some stuff here that should not be done. And thankfully, you know, yet like you said, like nothing was harmed, nobody feelings were hurt, but that's something people don't even like also should understand about sometimes with kinks, that some things are better in one space than another and should just be left that way. Some kinks are just work better in different environments. Not every kink works in all environments for everybody.
Yeah, and sometimes the fantasy is just good as a fantasy.
Yeah.
But it's not good in
Mhm.
reality. You know, I was listening to an episode of this podcast called The Trouble with Sex, and it was this episode. Let me see if I can find it. Yes, it's called The Measure of Masculinity. And it's the host is interviewing um, this sex therapist named Dr. Barry McCarthy. And something they talk about is what is the value of fantasy. And he noted, like, he's seen, like, in his practice clinically as a sex therapist, that often the fantasy was good as a fantasy and they didn't want to actually turn it into something else. They just wanted to keep it as a fantasy, and that alone was good. Um, so it's interesting how that works psychologically, that sometimes the fantasy is good as the fantasy. It's not about, a fantasy isn't about returning it into reality. It just is.
I have a lot of those where I have fantasies that just stay as fantasies. I don't actually want them to happen because it's very problematic. The type
Yeah.
of stuff, right? And for me personally, it's one of the ways that I cope with previous trauma. As a sexual assault survivor, having those fantasies helps me work through and grieve and feel and heal and ultimately heal. But those fantasies, I don't actually want them to happen.
Yeah.
Because that would just nix any point that I was trying to go through by having the fantasy in the first place. And I think fantasies are just really good to have. You have your little nugget that you keeps you warm at night, lets you spend some quality time with yourself, and you can go from there. But I think certain things are worth exploring when you have somebody you trust wholly, that you feel like you can enact that fantasy with. Otherwise, it can get real gnarly real fast.
Yeah. And you can have a fantasy that you don't even necessarily approve of. It's just a fantasy, and pretty much every clinician that I've talked to or heard from talking this topic will say it's okay and normal to have fantasies or thoughts about things that are not okay in the real world. That's just a human thing. We don't have pure minds. Our brains come up with weird things, and sometimes they fixate on things for different reasons. And it's not something to be scared of, it's just an opportunity to learn from that. Like, what is that telling you? Or maybe is there a different way that you could do that in practice that is ethical and not problematic? It's just a way to learn about your brain and kind of what's going on.
Yeah, and that's why, like, sometimes in regards to like sex workers and people who participate in these fantasies for hire, that sometimes helps them to facilitate those fantasies that might not be comfortable with maybe a close one, or like not necessarily a stranger, but someone who's a professional who's involved in studies in regards to facilitating those fantasies. Like there's like dominatrix who are specific in the dealing with the fantasy of kidnapping. Like they'll start doing this whole entire like planning series where they'll plan where they're going to take their client, and coming up with an entire like room and space and environment so the person can live it out. And maybe after that experience, they're like, you know what? I'm good. I don't want to deal with the kidnapping fantasy. It was a cool idea at the beginning, but that's it. Got out of my system. It's gone. But like the fact that this dominatrix had like the money, the experience, and the knowledge of how to, curate this space, that's why certain things and certain kinks sometimes is better off done with a professional than done with someone who has like no idea where they're going into, because you don't want someone to get hurt.
Yeah. Some kinks take a lot of skill.
Yes. Oh gosh,
There are a
yes.
lot of skills that I do not have. I don't know how to tie somebody up. I will never tie somebody up until I learn, because I don't know how to. And that's really dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just have a lot of admiration for practitioners and professionals
Mm.
of various kinks, because like there is so much skill and so much time and effort, and these are skills learned over years. I mean, like any job, any professional, masters of their trade. And I just amazing. It's just so amazing. I'm like, oh, I just got my little whips and my little paddles over here, like I'm cool with it. I'll hang out with my stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. It's been a long day, you guys.
Yeah.
It has been.
Do you guys have any like kink media that you discovered or would like to share? Because when we were talking also about kink, like a lot of people also discover kink through media, like popularly, 50 Shades of Grey did open up, even though it is a controversial it's a controversial book, but that book still did open a lot of eyes to the public of kink and what it entails, even though it's very poorly written. Well, not poorly written, but it just misrepresents what kink really is, or what it can be. I think like a good instead of like an alternative media to 50 Shades of Grey is like this older movie called Secretary with
love that movie. Oh,
Yeah.
so good.
That is probably the best representation of like an office place kink environment where the main character, this girl, was dealing with a lot of like trauma and like physical harm, and through kink she was like able to let go of one aspect of herself and let the pain be satiated through another form where he would like dominate and like do physical impact play and other things as well. And he was obviously a more experienced dom, and it got very intense and intimate, even though they never had physical sex, but she felt an intense romantic attraction to the guy. But yeah, I felt like that movie has a better, more positive representation towards kink than other.
I think The Secretary is what 50 Shades of Grey wishes it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a great movie. I really enjoyed that. I'm trying to think of other media, and unfortunately I just keep thinking of like poor examples. Like, okay, I'm really into the show Gotham that was on TV about like Batman villains and whatnot, and like it's really campy and it's very bad. But like one of the villains is called the Ogre, and he like takes women into his kinky sex room and then brutally murders them. And I'm like, that's just not a thing that happens.
Isn't there also like a dominatrix character in that?
I probably
Okay,
I don't know. They're all very much in love with leather, like tight leather, and like fetish wear as costume, and like I thoroughly enjoy the costume design, and it's my favorite bad soap opera, and it got canceled, so this is where we're at.
So what I was going to recommend actually is the podcast Body Storytelling. Have either of you heard of that?
No.
Mm-mm.
It's like, well, first of all, it's also actually like live events, but then like recordings of the live events, and now recordings of events that they do to be COVID safe get put on so you can listen to it instead of attending one of the events. And it's just people just sharing like true stories, usually about sex, but it also ends up being about kink. A lot of the time, so depending on the story. And the episode that I just listened to today was from the person who played the dominatrix in that show. And so she was kind of talking about how she explored kink and how she auditioned for the show and the research that she did, because she has a PhD, not in anything sexuality related, but just because she's a researcher, the research that she put into learning about it. It was interesting. I just think that it's a great podcast to just learn about people's lived experiences with things, and you get to hear kind of the good, bad, and the ugly of mistakes people made, or things that went wrong. A lot of it's very funny, but also sometimes very serious, and you learn a lot from it. I think it's just a great podcast.
And what was that podcast again?
body storytelling, body BAWDY storytelling.
Body. Oh, it's a pun. I love it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's pretty cool.
Oh, I'm trying to think. Maybe what we can do is after we're done with our episode, we can put up some of our favorite kink media and kink positive media to share with people for them to explore at their leisure. Since we're coming up on the end of the day, our brains are getting a little bit fried, and the rain is just good for sleeping. And like, you know what? Maybe that's our kink for today, is just take a nap together, right? Just take a big giant nap and call it a good one. You know,
there's people who get hired just to do professional cuddling. You know, that could be a kink in itself, just cuddling.
Okay.
All
Yeah,
I just
have
want
that-
is social intimacy. That's gonna be a new kink after COVID.
oh,
It's just
100%. I can't
cuddling.
wait to touch people again. Just touch me. Just hug me and touch me. Don't do anything else. Let me sob. Please love me.
I just want a stranger to hold me at the bar when I'm drinking too much, so I could complain about my true life events.
Oh, yes. I'm into this. I'm living for it. But also, I mean, I guess that brings up a pretty interesting point. You know, we're in quarantine. We're all stuck by ourselves, or perhaps with a partner, or families around, or whatever. Like everything's going to be different once we're all able to, be human together again. And you might see an uptick in people exploring, different kinks. As a way to connect, as a way to find that intimacy and, feel human again.
Yeah. I think that's just something we're all craving at some point. We've already reached the year mark, and
I was like, it's been a year. I'm ready. Let's go. Chop, chop. Oh my gosh. Well, we're coming up on an hour. We had a little bit of a struggle at the beginning, but
it's that slow go.
I think that was the foreplay, right? Like we were getting in the mood. We were warming up.
That awkward moment when you finally meet the person after texting them for 20 minutes.
You're like, oh, okay. This is who we're with. All right. But let's see. What do we have coming up for No Divide? We'll have another artist spotlight next month, to TBD, to be announced, who will be chilling with and exploring their art with them. So keep an eye on our socials, at No Divide KC, all lowercase, no spaces, Instagram, Facebook. You can also go to our website at nodividekc.org, where you can learn about all our upcoming events, as well as submitting to our Queer Narratives Festival, which those submissions are open until April 11th. All art forms are welcome. All skill levels are welcome. We want queer artists to come and hang out with us for our extravaganza later this summer. And then, of course, join us for our next hot dish, which is the third Thursday of the month.
Last Thursday. Yeah. April
Last
20th.
Thursday. Awesome. And so we would love to see you there. Thanks you to everyone talking in the chat. It was really good to see some discussion in there. But JD, Kat, it's always a delight to hang out with you guys.
Likewise. This was fun.
And so
I felt like we discussed a lot of interesting topics that weren't just, purely sex and kink based. It was some stuff around it.
it's very intersectional, and I think that's the biggest takeaway, is that kink literally is excellent at negotiation, consent, respect, trust, and these are things you can apply in so many different areas of your life.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. It's supposed to be sunny. Get out, get that vitamin D, and Live it up.
Have a good night.